We're speaking to Mark Clifford, president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Mark lived in Hong Kong for 28 years as a veteran journalist covering business and politics in Asia, and he's the author of the new book, The Troublemaker: How Jimmy Lai Became a Billionaire, Hong Kong's Greatest Dissident, and China's Most Feared Critic. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
Hey, thanks, Emily. Great to be here.
Let's dive right into the book and on who is Jimmy Lai. So in the opening of the book, you open with this spectacular scene. It's December 2023, and the trial against Jimmy Lai, after months of delay, was finally about to begin. Lai is now 77 years old. He is in a maximum security prison in Hong Kong and in solitary confinement. Mark, in the eyes of the CCP, what makes Jimmy Lai so dangerous?
Yeah, well, that's a great place to start, Emily. He exemplifies, he has three characteristics, any which one of which the CCP would hate. He's rich, although he's lost a lot of his money to the CCP. So he has resources. He can hire the best lawyers that money can buy. He used to have this media empire. I was on the board of directors of Apple Daily, Next Magazine, very powerful in Taiwan, in Hong Kong. So he's got what the CCP would regard as a propaganda platform, a megaphone, and we know how seriously the CCP takes propaganda. And he's got principles. He's willing to lay down his life if he has to in defense of freedom. So you take these things together, money, media, principles, and the Chinese Communist Party is facing the likes of somebody, an opponent, as they would see it, that they've never seen in their 75 years of rule. So that makes him uniquely dangerous. And the fact that he's willing, he stayed in Hong Kong when he could have left. He's a British citizen. He decided to stay and fight for freedom. By his example, he's not leading millions of people out in the streets, but by his example, his willingness to suffer for Hong Kong, for freedom, is something that makes him unique and uniquely dangerous in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party. I would say it makes him uniquely heroic.
There's a lot of great details in the book about Lai's early days in China. Jimmy Lai was born in Guangdong in 1948, just before the communists took power. His childhood was marked by a period of famine in China and by his strained relationship with his father. He had a business mindset even from a young age. And then he was a porter at a train station where he carried luggage for many Western passengers. When he was 12 years old, he fled to Hong Kong, and the year was 1961. He cramped into a fishing boat. Here's a sentence of Lai reflecting on the moment he arrived in Hong Kong. He said, "When I look at the new world ahead of me, I knew I have arrived. I have arrived at a world where life is worth living. I was a 12-year-old boy. I just had a close brush with hell. But once I set foot on the beach, I have grown into a man." Mark, you've known Jimmy since 1993. What did he tell you about those early days in China?
We were lucky because Jimmy wrote more than 1,500 weekly columns for Next Magazine. So he reflected a lot. Of course, the reflection he has about he had become a man and things was written when he was a man many years later, when he was already fairly successful. So, we do have to take that with a few grains of salt. But it was clear that he was even as a kid, it was an extraordinary individual. I mean, he was a hustler. This was a time of total political upheaval in China. As you say, he was born right before the revolution, the Maoist takeover, the communist takeover, ripped apart his family. His father, you alluded to the strained relationship, left for Hong Kong, leaving his mother, Jimmy, a twin sister, and a sister who was a couple of years older behind. This was a life of just unbelievable privation and poverty and struggle and just emotional upheaval. His mother, he was so close to, and she lived to almost 100, would come home on weekends, bringing burned rice for the kids, that she'd scraped out of the pot where she cooked. And then towards the end, and I think this is what finally prompted him to leave, it was the so-called misnamed Great Leap Forward, where we saw something on the order of 45 million people die of famine, starvation. So this was the China, of Jimmy Lai's childhood.
Let's talk a bit about his arrival into Hong Kong. He was an illegal immigrant, but he started working as a teenager at factories. He did this so well that he eventually owned and grew his own textile manufacturer as an export leader from the city. And in 1981, when he was just 33 years old, he founded this fast fashion brand called Giordano, which Giordano, for anybody who's been to Taiwan or Hong Kong or China today, it's ubiquitous. And that was an era of high economic growth of Hong Kong. But by the end of the decade came a turning point, which was the 1989 Tiananmen massacre that took place in China. Can you talk about his involvement during this time? He supported the protesters in Beijing. He donated T-shirts and cash and tents up in Beijing.
Yeah, I mean, Emily, you key on probably certainly one of the most, if not the most important turning points in his life. He's going along. He's a crazy rich Asian. By the late 80s, he was kind of bored. He was getting ready to take Giordano public on the stock exchange. And he's actually thinking of getting into Chinese fast food. He's a huge foodie. And, I think part of that certainly reflects the hunger that he suffered as a child. And he's thinking of doing kind of for Chinese food what he did for Giordano, and what kind of 5 years later Chipotle would do for Mexican food in the States. Give consumers lots of choice, but make something that's very efficient, high quality. So he's going along thinking about his Chinese fast food things. And as you say, the students in 1989 in Beijing and really throughout China rallied in support of democracy, against corruption, to make China a modern place. And Jimmy was totally smitten. He's a guy who, in his words at least, had really turned his back on China after he left. I mean, the horror that he had gone through. He'd eventually gotten his mother out. He'd occasionally gone and visited, but not much. He'd started manufacturing there, very importantly. And he was really smitten by really enamored, taken by Deng Xiaoping's reforms of the 1980s. He thought that economic reform inevitably was going to lead to political and social change. So when he saw what was happening in Tiananmen, I mean, he was, I think, overjoyed. He made T-shirts. He, with the student activist leaders on the T-shirts, sold those at the Giordano stores, sent the money up to Beijing, as you say, sent tents and other material up. So, I mean, he was just enraptured. And then, of course, came the Tiananmen killings of June 3rd, June 4th, 1989. And I think he went into a kind of shock or into a kind of mourning. He decided that he'd move into media. I mean, so kind of overnight, he goes from Chinese fast food into media. His thinking was, hey, there's a new technology is making transparency and accountability of governments possible in a way that we'd never had before. I mean, it's so hard for us to imagine now, but Tiananmen was almost the first time that the world saw events like that unfolding more or less in real time. CNN was pretty new. Jimmy was really captivated by CNN. And Jimmy, I think, was very, very farsighted. He still feels that the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, is living on borrowed time, and that by shining, I guess, and you might say the sunlight of disinfectant is how media people often talk about it, with disinfectant of sunlight, just by shining a spotlight on the abuses of the CCP, that it would be unable to survive. And he figures, I'm in Hong Kong, the Chinese are taking over in 1997, but we've got a chance to do something, and I'll start this magazine.
You talked to an aide to Martin Lee, who was a lawyer, activist, who later becomes a lifelong friend of Jimmy Lai. This aide, and she said, quote, a lot of people would condemn the harsh measures against the students, but no businessman was doing anything like Jimmy. You arrived in Hong Kong in 1992. But looking back in Hong Kong at the time, what did it mean for the business community that somebody did this? He was so rare. And why headbutt against a regime that you just saw what they were capable of during Tiananmen?
Yeah, I mean, that gets to the heart of who Jimmy is. And you asked before, why, why the Chinese Communist Party is so afraid of him. He's a guy who's not afraid to make trouble. He's been, as far as he's concerned, he's been through hell as a kid, right? This would have destroyed, 9,999 people out of 10,000. He's been to hell and beyond. And yet he's come to Hong Kong. He's found freedom. He's found success. He understands the difference between Hong Kong and China. And he knows that if Hong Kong is to remain prosperous, the people have to fight for it. It's fine. It's great that Martin Lee and all these Democrats, all these political people, activists are fighting for Hong Kong. But he's a guy with resources, and he can fight in a way that they can't. It's just so rare among business people that he actually has principles. I mean, I know a lot of business people. I ran the Asia Business Council for a while. There are a lot of good people, but most of them are not going. I mean, I can't think of anybody other than Jimmy, really, who is going to risk his business or her business for the sake of a principle. And Jimmy is that rare individual who will stand up. He's that nail that, the Communist Party decided needed to be hammered down. But he understood correctly, as these other businessmen didn't, the CCP would destroy Hong Kong if people didn't stand up for it. And so it is interesting, after that first meeting with Martin Lee, which was right after Tiananmen, Martin's, they had no money. They didn't have a fax machine. Think of the days when, getting a fax machine was a big deal. Next day, Jimmy sends over a fax machine. So, he had the money, he had the resources. He could make things happen. He was a businessman. He was used to making things happen. So if it was starting a new media business, or if it was taking that media business in a very political direction at, incredible personal risk to him, that's just who he is. I mean, after the, kind of fall of Hong Kong, after the national security law was passed in 2020, it was really disappointing to see how few people stood up. And then I realized actually the remarkable thing is that anybody stands up in the face of the Chinese Communist Party. And Jimmy's he's that guy.
Let's talk about that media empire that Jimmy Lai created. So he launches the Apple Daily newspaper in 1995, and that's 2 years before the Hong Kong's handover to China. And it had the best reporters, the best investigative reporters, business reporters, but also the best entertainment and gossip reporters. It carried a pro-democracy voice, and readers had a love-hate relationship with the paper. And at the turn of the century, starting the year 2000, Jimmy Lai then brought both Next Magazine and Apple Daily to Taiwan. For the next decade, the Taiwan operation grew to include multiple newspapers, magazines, a TV station, a 600-person animation studio, gaming company, and so on. The Apple Daily newspapers had the top readerships in both Hong Kong and Taiwan. The Next Group employed many journalists in both places, myself included at that time. But the years that followed 2010 is now seen as the beginning of the fall of the Next Group, and also, as we'll see, of freedom in Hong Kong. Mark, you were a board of director of the group in its later years until its closure in 2020. During your research for this book, what did you learn about Jimmy Lai that you hadn't known before, about Apple Daily, Next Magazine, that really surprised you?
Well, a couple things. First of all, as you said, I've known Jimmy since 1993. I always knew he was a good entrepreneur, but there are 10,000 good entrepreneurs in Hong Kong, and I hadn't realized what an extraordinary entrepreneur it is. And that's what makes it even more unfathomable to me why a business city like Hong Kong would lock up, couldn't figure out a better way of dealing with a guy who brought so much wealth, so many jobs, so much entrepreneurial spirit to a place that calls itself a global financial center, that really saw itself as a kind of the center of laissez-faire capitalism. And then extending that kind of notion about entrepreneurialism. Yeah, I mean, I knew him, when he was just starting out in media, of course, Apple, Next, I mean, very exciting. Honestly, living in Hong Kong, what was going on in Taiwan wasn't quite as obvious. And in fact, as part of my research for this book, I spent the better part of a month in Taiwan. And I guess when I went on the board, I knew it was important, but I hadn't quite realized how important for how long Taiwan was. not just in terms of number of people and other publications and things, but also for Jimmy's thinking. First of all, it showed his ability to move outside of Hong Kong. A lot of entrepreneurs, have a hard time moving outside their own country, and say that's particularly true in Asia, but it's true in America too. Jimmy was able to go to Taiwan. He was able to bring that formula, even though Taiwan was very, very different. I mean, he moved there because of Chen Shui-bian's election as president. And he was just so happy that finally democracy was coming to a Chinese nation. And so his whole stance in Taiwan was really different. In Hong Kong, they were always very, very anti-government. And in Hong Kong, they were really anti-government. They were really outsiders. And in Taiwan, he saw his job as much more of busting up the traditional media monopoly and the closeness with which most media organizations, the ties that they had to political parties. He played a different role. I wouldn't say he was an insider, but he certainly was a lot closer to government officials, had government people writing columns for him. So he was much more kind of entwined with Taiwanese politics. Of course, he was always a Hong Konger. He was always an outsider. Jimmy is always going to be an outsider. And then the final point I'd make is quite different, which is that his naivete, or maybe his optimism, really was on full display in Taiwan, because he thought that he could use that as a springboard to the mainland. And he was really convinced in the early 2000s, between, say, Taiwan and China's accession to the WTO and the Beijing Olympics during that Hu Jintao, that kind of softer kind of period. He was really convinced that he was going to be able to sell Apple and Next in the mainland, and the Mandarin editions that he was producing in Taiwan would give him the springboard into the mainland. So, 20 years on, that looks, just crazily optimistic, misplaced, but those were the times. So Taiwan was a really, really important part of his life. He's still got a house there. I've seen some of the things he's written from prison, where he's fantasizing about moving to Taiwan, eating food in Taiwan. I mean, he really has a soft spot for Taiwan. And yet it was the first and only time that he was kind of really involved with politics more. And I think kind of every president disappointed him. He would go in with high hopes, and then they would end up disappointing him. And he's a radical free market guy, and he worked to try to see if Taiwan could open up its economy more, and it never was doing it enough for him. So it was a very really important place for him.
Yeah, I think the papers on both in both places, in Hong Kong and Taiwan, they were so interesting in the landscape, in that it had this. A former colleague described it as a mix between New York Post and the Washington Post, right? And it was the best of both, and it had such wide readership, but readers hated it or loved it, right? It was a very, very, very polarized opinion from the public about Apple Daily, but at the end of the day, it was very clear on its pro-democracy stance in both places. And I think this came into clear later in the 2010s, as we saw what happened in Hong Kong from 2012, where students protested against the change of the proposal to change of national curriculum, to umbrella movement, where tens and thousands of protesters slept on the streets. And this is when Jimmy Lai also joined the protesters on the streets. He was attacked by anti-protesters with pig intestines. And later on, he also really supported through the 2019s, when 1 million people march on the streets. For a lot of young people who didn't remember the Apple Daily story, didn't remember Jimmy Lai's support for democracy back in the days, they came to know Jimmy Lai in a different light, and he became a new symbol of pro-democracy voices. Throughout this period, you were still in Hong Kong. How did you see Jimmy Lai evolve during this time?
Yeah, Yeah, it's a really great question, Emily. And I learned a lot more of this in the biography than it wasn't quite as apparent to me at the time. But so, okay, starts Apple in 95, the Chinese take over in 97, pro democracy, but as you say, all over the place, went to the good edge of good taste and beyond sometimes tawdry. As you say, people had a love hate relationship. I always think of it as the guilty pleasure. People would say, I hate that thing. And then you get, and this would be like some prominent business person, you get in their car and you'd find it would be there. It would be their read next or Apple would be there. So everybody hated it, or not everybody. Many people hated it and everybody read it, or at least had to know what was in there. But and yes, they were pro-democracy, they were anti-corruption, but I think a key turning point was in 2003 when Apple and Next were instrumental in rallying the opposition to the first national security law. And they took what had been a movement when it started of a dozen or so people burning a copy of this draft law, over a bonfire, making a bonfire of it, to 500,000 people out in the streets about 8 months later on July 1st, 2003. Ended up bringing about the resignation of Teng Chee-hwa, the first chief executive of Hong Kong, and a couple other ministers. So I think at that point, Apple and Next and Jimmy started realizing their real political potency. The opposition parties were explicitly set up to be, or the structure was that they had to be weak. And so Apple and Next and Jimmy became almost the de facto opposition political party. Interestingly, Jimmy himself never wanted political power. He's not a Nelson Mandela. He's not a Lech Walesa. I mean, he's not even really a Liu Xiaobo in terms of being an intellectual leader. I mean, he's a businessman. He's a man of action. He's a newspaper guy. He's a daily guy out there responding to events. But 2003 is a big turning point. And then, as you say, 2012. But again, during that decade, he'd been in Taiwan a lot. He'd been fighting a lot of business battles in Taiwan and against entrenched interests, especially in the television industry, trying to get a broadcast license unsuccessfully. Really set back by that. It was a big business setback in his life because it had to do with, in his mind, collusion, not with anything he could have done differently. So he kind of was licking his wounds, wasn't that involved? Here he's getting older at that point. And I mean, still is obviously, but was kind of pulling back. And then as I think you're absolutely right to mention the students in 2012, Joshua Wong and the others, all of a sudden they're getting 50,000 people out in the streets. And I think Jimmy was really taken by this. And in 2014, he went on this, it wouldn't be right to call it a pilgrimage, but he walked around Hong Kong with Cardinal Zen and others, just talking to people on the street. And I think that really energized him. This was in the spring. This was before the umbrella movement, but it was when there was talk of Occupy Central, which was kind of the nucleus of what became the umbrella movement. So that brought Jimmy back in. And then you're absolutely right. Jimmy's out there for 79 days. He wasn't sleeping out there like the students were, but he was out there every day. He missed his son Sebastian's birthday because he wanted to be out there with his students and show solidarity and bear witness. And he did. And he was tear gassed. At the end, he offered himself up for arrest. He was arrested, although charges weren't filed. So I think 2003, 2014, Jimmy and Next and Apple are both, leading the movement and yet being, brought along with the movement. Jimmy in particular, I think. And then in 2019, as you say, he and the paper and magazine were all in.
Let's talk about the eventual arrest of Jimmy Lai and the closure of the entire Apple Daily operation in Hong Kong, and as well as the others who are in jail today still. It has to do with the national security law that was implemented in July 2020. So the Hong Kong government had tried multiple times prior to national security law to arrest Jimmy Lai. Can you walk us through kind of the evolution of the case against him? What did they charge him with initially, and how did that change after national security law came into effect?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I hope the answer won't be too boring because you get down to the details. And this is really lawfare. This is using the legal system the veneer of a proper legal system to reach predetermined political ends. In this case, the end goal was to shut Jimmy Lai up, to neutralize him as an opponent of the Chinese Communist Party. And to do this, they used a variety of traditional laws, civil disobedience laws, some new ones. He's now serving a jail term of 5 years and 9 months for fraud. This consists of nothing more than subleasing a tiny portion, a little bit, about half the size of one half of a tennis court, if you can imagine, just a really small space in this huge media complex. He leased it and paid rent. He leased it for a private company on his behalf that ran a lot of his investments and things. Honestly, most tycoons wouldn't have bothered. They wouldn't have bothered paying rent. They would have just used the space. But he did. He declared it. We knew about it on the board of directors. Shareholders knew about it. And yet somehow this was deemed fraud because the government owned the underlying land and had leased it to the media company for 50 years. Again, I'm not really sure what the fraud was here. It's never been used in a Hong Kong court. This has always been a civil case. It would be a bit like you have an apartment, I rent it from you, and you say no pets, I bring my cat in. That's probably actually more serious than what Jimmy did. And yet somehow this through various sleight of hand became a fraud charge. 5 years and 9 months. Think about that. Almost 6 years for a technical lease violation. I mean, it just shows the lengths to which they're willing to go. He's also been convicted of incitement to riot. This was an interesting one. On June 4th, 2020, the first time that Tiananmen commemorations were not allowed in Hong Kong, ostensibly because of the pandemic, Jimmy was driven in his car to Victoria Park, which is, of course, the commemoration site. And he got out of his car, he lit a candle, he said a prayer, he refused to say anything to the media around him, and he got back in the car. So that was incitement to riot. I mean, it's one bogus case after another. But the big one, the really big one, is the national security law case. And so that first surfaced August 10th, 2020, when Jimmy was arrested at his home early one morning, handcuffed, put handcuffs, hands behind his back, hustled into a police car, and taken down to his office, perp walked through the headquarters. It was an extraordinary scene. 250 police there, raiding the place, rifling through desks, hassling reporters and journalists. And so at that same day, his two sons were arrested. His two sons from his first marriage, adult sons who have nothing to do with the media business, politics. They were all arrested on national security law charges. And those charges still hang over the sons, who aren't able to travel freely, who have to report to the police from time to time. And so that became the start. Then there were, I guess that was the beginning of the national security law case. Then he was thrown in jail in December that year, December 2020. More specifically, his bail was revoked on this laughable fraud charge that related to the sublease. So it's kind of like one weird legal thing after another. It's like it makes your head spin trying to follow it. But again, you've got judges with nice British wigs on, and they all look like it's all proper, but they're distorting the law. They're distorting Hong Kong's really fine common law tradition because they want to destroy a political enemy. It's shameful that the judges and the prosecutors have gone along with this charade. I can tell you what's happened in the last few years with the trial and things, but I'll stop there for the moment.
How transparent have these court proceedings been?
Yeah, the court proceedings themselves are relatively transparent. I say relative. In the mainland, when people are convicted, they tend to be closed door and or very, very rapid. In Jimmy's case, they are open door. There are a few seats that the public is allowed to take. Media is allowed, but there's no video. There are no pictures. We haven't seen a picture of Jimmy, in fact, since one was surreptitiously taken by the Associated Press in 2023. So coming up on 2 years now, in the summer of 2023. It is good news that the proceedings at least are open to the public, to media, to his family. and to foreign diplomats. Again, they're a joke. This trial has been going on since December 2023, the national security law trial. We've had roughly 140 days of court proceedings, and all they've succeeded in proving is Jimmy Lai is a journalist who believes in democracy, who practiced journalism. I mean, they're basically saying that what Jimmy did, which supposedly was protected by Hong Kong's basic law, its mini constitution, by the Sino-British Declaration, which set the terms for China's takeover of Hong Kong. They're saying that all this stuff is nonsense, that it doesn't matter, that the guarantees of free speech, free press, free assembly are just thrown out the window. They're saying that the promises of a jury trial, the promise to have your own lawyer, are no longer valid in the case of Jimmy. So the lengths that they're going to twist and distort the law to keep Jimmy behind bars are just extraordinary.
Do you think he will be released?
I do. I think that he will be found guilty. I think he'll be sentenced, well, to minimum 10 years, which is effectively a life sentence at this point. But I think that Jimmy is proving more trouble behind bars than he would be, outside and free. As I said, he's a British citizen. He'd like to leave Hong Kong. He deserves to spend the rest of his life, in freedom with his family. And I've been delighted to see that President Trump has said that he, at least on the campaign trail, said that 100% he'd get Jimmy Lai out. So he's on the president's radar screen. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who would have to play a role, given the fact that Jimmy's a British citizen, has said that it's a priority to get Jimmy out. He's expressed that concern about Jimmy in front of TV cameras with Xi Jinping in the room. So I think that some sort of solution can be worked out to allow Jimmy to go free.
Jimmy Lai was eventually arrested, as you said, in December 2020. A very big deal for the CCP, who's tried for decades to, as you said, shut him up. Lai, he's no stranger to stories and the fates of dissidents and political prisoners. After the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, Lai remained in touch with all three student leaders. You alluded to Liu Xiaobo earlier. So when the late jailed Chinese dissident writer Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, Lai attended the ceremony in Oslo. And in November, a month before Lai's arrest in 2020, he spoke with the former Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky during a conversation which, Mark, you moderated. Sharansky wrote a memoir called Fear No Evil about his decade in the Soviet prison in the 1970s and the 80s. I want to play a clip here of what Jimmy said to Sharansky at the end of the interview.
Can be my mentor because I really am wearing your spirit as my core. I really relate to what you said so much because what you said about physical survival is not important. Spiritual survival it is very important. Never back down. The peak of your life is when you were in prison. I totally understand. And that is very important for me because I take up the responsibility of imagining myself influencing so many people as an example. If I don't back down and they will not back down. So that is a responsibility that is also an uplifting spirit for me. And, I really thank you very much for inspiring me on this.
Jimmy, it is so moving for me and exciting.
Remembering that moment, Mark, did you get a sense that perhaps he knew that he was to be arrested soon?
It's a great question, Emily. I think I was too stupid to quite realize it at the time. I mean, Jimmy knew it. It was only 2 or 3 weeks before his bail was revoked, and he was he was put in prison. To me, it was just inconceivable that they would actually jail Jimmy Lai. So I think I was in a state of denial. Looking back, and I've subsequently talked to Sharansky separately. I've looked at that tape. He knew exactly what was happening. And Sharansky, and he knew what was happening. He was about to go to jail, and he wanted to be the best political prisoner he could be, just like he wants to be the best at whatever he does. And it's actually really chilling and sobering to go back and watch the tape or listen to those words.
But would you? You cannot visit him in prison. Is that right?
No, I'd be afraid to go to Hong Kong at this point.
That's right.
I don't write Jimmy Lai. I cut off contact when we were just starting organizing work for what became the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Jimmy's on trial. The actual charges against him are collusion with foreign forces, 2 counts of that, and 1 count of sedition. Collusion with foreign forces seems to be having any contact with a foreigner. I mean, given the fact that Jimmy's a British citizen, that's a little bit odd. Why it's 2 counts rather than 2,000 or 2 million, I don't know, given the fact Jimmy had many, many, many foreign friends. The court heard that I'm not a co-conspirator, but I know a lot of the people that they say were involved with Jimmy's supposed crimes.
Does he know about the book yet?
No idea. I'm just not in touch with him. So
yeah. What is the sense of, you haven't spoken to him, you just said you've cut off contact, but what do you know about how is he communicating with the outside world, with the rest of the community still?
Yeah, well, he's pretty isolated. He's not just in a maximum security prison, but most of the time he's been held in solitary confinement. So you think of that, more than 1,500 days behind bars, mostly in solitary confinement. You don't know what time it is. You have no natural light. You don't have a clock. You don't control when your lights go on, when they go off, what you eat, when you eat. And so it's pretty rough. But people who are in touch with him tell me that he's as free as he's ever been. And he's living this kind of rarefied spiritual life. And he's trying to take himself to a different plane. He converted to Catholicism under the influence of his second wife, Teresa, who has been, absolute rock for him. She's in court every single day. She's stayed in Hong Kong. She's able to visit him in prison 3 or 4 times a month for half an hour at a time, behind plexiglass, of course. She can wave to him in court, but she can't actually talk to him. He does get some letters out to friends. I mean, obviously they're censored. He is trying to do what he talked about in that Sharansky interview, which is to live as a free man, knowing that he doesn't control his physical freedom. It's his captors who decide when he's physically going to walk free. But within that, he can live as a free man, and his Catholic faith and his family are absolutely critical to that. So he has to do prison labor. He makes 600 envelopes a week, the last I heard, for about a penny an envelope. I don't think the money matters too much to him. But he reads a lot of theology, Catholic theology. He does a lot of religious drawings. He prays a lot. He tries to, live as free a life as he can within the confines of this. All that said, he's in his late 70s. He suffered diabetes before going into prison. His childhood as a factory worker is kind of catching up on him. He lost hearing in one ear as a result of his work in the factory, lost a fingertip as well. He's had COVID since he's been in prison. He had what seems to have been a botched cataract operation. He's having some trouble seeing and hearing in court, it seems like. So, he may be mentally, spiritually free, but I think physically he's suffering. It would be really tough on anyone. Solitary confinement is considered by the United Nations under the Mandela principles, named after Nelson Mandela, is considered a form of torture. It should be a last resort, and it shouldn't last more than 15 days. It's been most of the 1,500 plus days that Jimmy's been in prison. He's been in solitary. So he's subject to some really, really tough conditions, but holding up as best as he can in those circumstances.
Do we know if he's getting the medical treatments that he needs?
I don't. I'm told by people who are closer to him that he's definitely not getting the treatment that he'd be getting on the outside. I mean, he's getting prison medical treatment. I guess that's the only thing we can say. There have been some real problems with his medical care and with the treatment that he's gotten from the prison medical staff.
Let's turn the chapter a little bit. You dedicate this book to the people of Hong Kong, quote, in the belief that they will one day win the freedom that is rightfully yours. So the CCP and the Hong Kong government have gone great length to intimidate, to curb the freedom of speech, to make it so that people submit to the government. Do you think it's worked on the people of Hong Kong?
Too early to say. Obviously, the people of Hong Kong are pretty beaten down at this point, and the slightest show of resistance brings, at the very least, a visit from the police or the national security law authorities. So, in that sense, it's worked. We're not seeing 1 million or 2 million people out in the streets. On the other hand, I don't get the sense that the people of Hong Kong are falling over themselves to pay tribute to the Chinese Communist Party. I think it's a standoff. In every single free election from 1991, when the British allowed the first territory-wide elections for city council, for LegCo, legislative council, until the last elections in 2019 for these low-level district council positions, roughly 6 out of 10 Hong Kong people have voted for democracy. Even though many people have left, it's hard for me to believe that most people in Hong Kong really don't want democracy. They don't want freedom. They just want to submit to the Chinese Communist Party and reap all the benefits of the totalitarian regime that we see in China. I just don't buy it.
What about on the business community? Is it you haven't been back, but from your contacts with the business community, what kind of pressure or kind of impact has it had on local and foreign businesses that operate in Hong Kong?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The Hong Kong stock market isn't really that much higher than it was in 1997 when China took over. So, I mean, I think that kind of gives you one marker. It's just completely lagged performance to especially the U.S. stock market indices. We're seeing a lot of financial firms quietly moving out of Hong Kong. Wealth management in particular has moved to Singapore. Look, Goldman Sachs doesn't ring a bell and put out a press release when it moves a bunch of people to Singapore, but employment certainly among Western financial firms is down. I think there's a pretty sour climate. It's not only because of politics. I mean, China's in the midst of the greatest economic challenge it's had, well, at least in the last 40 years. The property crash there just continues to reverberate, and Hong Kong is very, very closely linked to the mainland economy. So you're having, some of the biggest property companies in Hong Kong really fighting for survival. I mean, perhaps the best known, most troubled company appears to be the New World Group, which was just a pillar of the Hong Kong establishment. So the politics piles on top of what's already a really, really difficult economic situation. In private, I'm told top business people are grumbling about the lack of leadership in Hong Kong. I mean, rather than the kind of career administrators who the British had groomed and the Chinese kind of reluctantly accepted, we've now got John Lee, who's a former cop who's been groomed by the Chinese Communist Party for decades, is running the city. All he seems to know is to tighten the screws more and more. Of course, business doesn't like that, but they're powerless or terrified to say anything for good reason. They look at Jimmy Lai. They see the price of speaking out. They see the price of trying to protect Hong Kong's freedoms. It's just not worth it.
John Lee he will be the chief executive until at least 2027. So in 2022, you and a group of others founded the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, a foundation that's based in the U.S. Whose work is advocacy for the Hong Kong people. Tell us about the foundation. How do you work with governments or communities?
Yeah, well, thanks. The Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation is fighting to keep Hong Kong freedom alive, sort of through a couple of different ways. We have offices in Washington, D.C. and in London. We work a lot with Parliament and with Congress, also work with the U.S. government in particular, to some degree with the U.K. government, but the U.S. government has been particularly receptive to our message, whether it's the National Security Council or the State Department or Treasury. So we think that governments, particularly in Washington and Washington and London, are really key to getting the message to China that it's time to ease off on Hong Kong. There is an exit ramp here. The continuing repression, continuing jailing, there's still almost 1,000 people behind bars in Hong Kong on political charges. It's just got to end. I mean, if Beijing does care about Hong Kong's role as a financial center, as an economic center, as a global powerhouse, then things can't go on like this. It's not going to end well if Jimmy Lai and others remain in jail. There's just got to be an easing. We can help find an off-ramp. We can help find diplomatic solutions. I think I'm not involved in negotiations, but letting Jimmy and other prisoners out could result in an easing on Hong Kong. There are sanctions on John Lee, on other officials. So, we're really focused on that. We do some terrific research. We've been key in bringing to the fore Hong Kong's newfound and very unfortunate role as a sanctions busting hub. I mean, much of the materiel for the Russian war effort is being smuggled through Hong Kong. Hong Kong is also helping facilitate bad behavior by Iran and its drone and its military program, North Korea, Myanmar. I mean, Hong Kong is involved with some very, very bad actors at this point. And we're helping to spotlight Hong Kong's role in the world in this sense. We do a lot of media work, of course. So that's, we're kind of a traditional, but I'd like to think fairly effective advocacy group. I mean, we do work around the world, but I think that London and Washington are key to unlocking what has to be a diplomatic solution. I mean, if you just leave people in jail for years on end, how can Hong Kong ever get restarted? And as you alluded to earlier, I mean, for me personally, as a former board member of Next Digital, it's just heartbreaking to see Jimmy in prison, but also 6 other people who were caught up at the same time or shortly after Jimmy in the summer of 2021. They've been thrown in jail. They've all 6 have pled guilty, and yet they're being held hostage for the end of Jimmy's case. I mean, it's inhumane. We could go on with story after story like that of political prisoners in Hong Kong, but we've got to keep the spotlight on these people. It's just not right that a place that calls itself a global financial center, that there's one political prisoner, let alone close to 1,000.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Mark. One final question before we go. Is there a favorite memory of your interaction with Jimmy Lai you'd like to share?
Yeah, so many. I think back to the first time I met him when he invited me to have lunch with him, and he was supposedly retired. This was 1993. He was living up on Tai Po Road in Kowloon, the hills of Kowloon, overlooking the harbor, and had this incredible place. That was when he was just moving out of living the life of the crazy rich Asian, but I think he probably still had his Rolls Royce and pet bear then and things. But the fact that he cooked lunch for me, and I've had CEOs invite me to lunch, not too many, but enough. But I never had one cook lunch for me before. And he just made me just a really nice, simple wok stir-fried. And, it just shows what an incredibly, generous, kind, down-to-earth, non-pretentious, curious guy he is. And looking back, that kind of set the stage, for me to understand him and for us to know each other.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. We'll be keeping an eye on the trial as well. I think it's we're expected to have a verdict by end of this year sometime.
Let's hope so. We had thought it was going to be a verdict in May and sentencing in June, kind of that time frame. But a judge in another case relating to the bankruptcy of Next Digital has said that she will finalize that immediately after his sentencing in October. So that was just in late February, she said that. So that was kind of news to all of us. But this is the forever trial that just keeps going on and on and on. And I think until the trial is finished, the people who are going to do the negotiating to do a deal can't really get to work. So the sooner the trial is finished, the better.
Mark Clifford, president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Ghost Island Media.